Welcome back to Fabulous Creations. I'm Ron, and this video will be the first in the series as I work to convert our standard two-car garage into a functional, all-season shop that I've dreamed of for years. Once it's completed, I'll be able to produce projects more efficiently and videos more frequently. As you can probably see behind me, I recently had supplies delivered to get started with the build-out, but first I'd like to take a few steps back and go over my rough plans for the garage and what I want to do within its walls, and that's what we'll go over in this video. Let's dive in. To get started with my planning, I first measured all the interior dimensions of the garage to know what I was working with. It turns out my garage, future shop, is roughly 18 feet by 21 feet, with the roof joists at 9 feet high. After I had my measurements, I decided to work in 2D for the time being by roughing out my plans in my design tool of choice, Adobe Illustrator. Eventually I'll probably want a working 3D model of the space in SketchUp or the like, especially before building workbenches and other shop furniture. Jay Bates really sold me on the nice to have factor of that in some of his videos where he goes over his shop, and it seems immensely helpful in terms of planning tool layout and functionality, especially when it comes time to move things around. One downside of Adobe Illustrator for this task is that it has its limits on how big your documents, canvases can be. But to be fair, I suppose your average graphic designer isn't going to be working with garage floor size documents, so we'll give Adobe a pass on this one. In order to still be able to use Illustrator for this preliminary phase, I decided to work in inches instead and work at 1/10 scale. 21 feet, 2 inches, for example, became 254 real-life inches, but in my document, I scaled it to 25.4 inches. This is just as accurate and it keeps everything to scale, and all I need to do is remember to move the decimal place over one. To the CAD fans out there who are cringing at this approach, I promise I'll do a better model in the future. After the floor plan was set up to scale, it was time to fill it with all of my tools and equipment, future tools and equipment. At the time of this planning, the only tools I have in my shop, apart from a few hand tools, are a cheap Harbor Freight miter saw, a cheap Harbor Freight drill press, a 14-inch jet bandsaw I got secondhand off Craigslist, and an old table saw that the previous owner of our house left behind. I bought the cheap Harbor Freight tools knowing they would work just fine for me to get started, and I could upgrade later once I knew what better meant for that particular tool. As for the bandsaw, I absolutely want to invest in a good one up front because that's one of my most used tools at the makerspace I'm a member of. So, those are the tools I had, but in this planning document, I decided to focus on what I wanted long term for my shop. One of the first things I decided was that I would eventually be building the Jay Bates miter saw station. If you're unfamiliar with Jay Bates, he's an incredibly smart and well-spoken woodworker here on YouTube who built his now iconic miter saw station for his own shop, and at least half a dozen other woodworkers on YouTube have built it for their own shops too. It delivers a ton of storage space and functionality in one smart design. So while I don't mean to play copycat, the fact that so many other makers have kind of vetted the design by building it too, it just speaks to how good of a design it is. Jay sells plans on his website, and I'll be purchasing them when I'm ready to build mine. Next up, I added a table saw. Like I said earlier, I currently have an old underpowered table saw, but eventually I'd like to get a saw stop. One, because they're damn nice saws, but also because my husband always worries I'm going to hurt myself, so knowing I won't lose a finger to a table saw is one less thing for him to have to worry about. Since I plan to get one someday, I decided to look up their measurements to make sure I knew exactly how much space it would take up. I decided to place the table saw facing the garage door so that in the event I ever need to cut anything super long, I can just open the garage door to have extra clearance. I also added in a future outfeed table that is the same size as the saw itself. Next up, after adding a few of my existing tools like the bandsaw and air compressor, I added a workbench. But not just any workbench, no. A workbench to help take advantage of the limited floor space in a garage. Mark over at Gunflint Designs designed a quite nifty double flip-top workbench that, as the name entails, has two areas that flip over to reveal a mounted tool stored underneath. He was gracious enough to send me the plans for his bench to build one of my own, and he sells plans over on his website if you're interested in building it too. I'll leave a link down below for you to check that out. Now, if you've watched any of my videos up until now, you know I love using the laser cutter at the makerspace I attend. I love designing things on the computer and using the laser to help bring them into the real world. The makerspace laser is great, but I would eventually love to have my own, so I decided to rough it into the plans for the shop. I grabbed the measurements of a Glowforge laser, as that's one of the more affordable consumer lasers on the market, but I've also researched Trotec and Epilog pretty extensively too. Either way, I wanted to plan for a laser in my shop, so in my planning document, I created a computer workstation to control the laser with. The items next to the laser are stand-ins for the monitor, keyboard, and trackpad, and of course a stool to sit at while working. Another facet of computer-aided design that I've been eager to dig into is CNC milling. It'll allow me to do many of the same things a laser does, but in addition to increased cut thickness, I'll be able to do 3D forms and relief carvings. So while this will be a bit down the line in terms of budgeting, I thought a perfect companion to the laser workstation would be a CNC machine that can share the same computer. I looked up measurements for the largest Shapeoko and the largest X-Carve, two of the well-known consumer models, and added a table to my design that could fit it. The nice thing about this layout is I'll have good visibility to what's going on at the CNC from my stool at the computer. So with those primary elements in place, the things I know I'll absolutely want to get at some point, my rough shop layouts were effectively complete. I still had space for some tools along the back wall, but really I need to actually get started using the space before knowing what tools I'm missing. I want to get into more lathe work in the future too, so I'm sure it's possible that I'll get a lathe for back there. I mentioned Jay Bates a few times in this video, and I'll probably mention him a few more times in this series. That's because Jay has done an incredible service to me and other people wanting to build out a shop by talking at length about his own shop build-outs on his channel. He talks about why he did certain things a certain way in his shop, rather than just what he did, which allowed me to take furious mental notes as I daydreamed about my future shop. One of the other things he's talked about in his videos is workflow optimization as it relates to the spacing between things like his miter saw station and the workbench behind him. He said he's found 32 inches to be the perfect amount of space to both work comfortably at the tool while also having the workbench be close by for assembly of the parts he just got done cutting, milling, etc. So in my layout, I added a visual boundary to a few of the centerpiece items in my shop, like the table saw and workbench, to make sure I had this ideal spacing around my work areas too. Finally, you may notice there's a bit of space left at the front of the shop near the garage door that's unaccounted for. I negotiated with my husband and we agreed that there still needs to be space for things like our lawnmower and snowblower in here if I'm taking over the entire garage, as we don't really have room in our yard to place a shed anywhere. I figured those items can be parked permanently at the front of the shop and out of the way of my work. So that's the rough plan. Now there are a ton of little details and parts unaccounted for that I haven't even bothered trying to plan. There are types of things that I know that I'll need to kind of like get in the space and start using it, start living in it, so to speak, before I know what I need and what I need to do next. So I'll kind of cross that bridge when I come to it. So with the planning out of the way, in the next video we'll go over the electrical sub panel I had installed in here that'll power all the tools in the shop. So stay tuned for that, and until next time, cheers.